I found the account by accident, searching for a recipe he'd mentioned making the week before, typing his username into Reddit's search bar out of pure, idle curiosity to see if he'd ever posted about cooking, and instead of a recipe thread, I found something that took me nearly 40 minutes to fully understand the scope of, because I genuinely could not process, at first, that I was reading exactly what I appeared to be reading. My husband had spent the better part of 5 months building what could only be described as a courtroom, an entire, meticulously organized case file laid out across dozens of posts in a subreddit called r/relationship_advice, presenting our marriage, piece by piece, as evidence for a jury of anonymous strangers to render a verdict on. My name is Evelyn Marsh, I'm 36 years old, and this is the story of the exact moment I discovered that my husband, Theo, had never actually brought his grievances to me directly, not once in 5 entire months, and had instead built an elaborate, curated public trial of our entire marriage, complete with screenshots, timelines, and a carefully constructed narrative designed, whether he understood it this way himself or not, to secure a verdict against me from thousands of complete strangers before I ever had the chance to defend myself, or even understand I was being tried at all. I need to explain how I actually found this, because the specific, mundane circumstances matter considerably to understanding exactly how long this had been happening beneath my own awareness. Theo and I had been married for 6 years, together for 8, and we shared, as most couples do after that long, a considerable number of small, overlapping digital habits, the same streaming services, occasionally the same online shopping carts, a running joke about a recipe app neither of us could ever remember the login for. I was sitting on our couch on an entirely ordinary Tuesday evening, Theo in the next room finishing up a work call, and I typed his Reddit username, one I knew simply because he'd mentioned it once, years earlier, into the search bar mostly out of boredom, expecting, if anything, to find a handful of comments about video games or local news, the kind of low-stakes, unremarkable digital footprint most people leave behind without much thought. What appeared instead was a post history considerably longer and more active than I would have ever guessed Theo maintained, and near the top of that history, a post from 3 days earlier with a title that made my stomach drop before I'd even fully processed what it said. Update: my wife still doesn't understand why I'm upset, 5 months in. I sat with that title for a long moment, feeling something cold settle into my chest, because I hadn't understood, until reading those 7 words, that there was an ongoing update, that this apparently had a considerable history stretching back 5 entire months, and that I was, somehow, completely unaware any of it existed. I want to describe exactly what I found scrolling backward through that post history, because the scale and specificity of it took me considerably longer to absorb than I expected, sitting there on our couch with my heart rate climbing steadily while Theo's voice carried faintly from the next room, still on that work call, entirely unaware of what I was discovering. The original post, dated exactly 5 months earlier, was titled AITA for feeling neglected by my wife of 6 years, and it opened with what I can only describe as a carefully constructed, one-sided account of our marriage that I genuinely did not recognize as our actual life together, despite every individual detail in it being, in some technical sense, factually accurate. He described, in that original post, a specific evening roughly 6 months earlier when I'd come home late from a work deadline, exhausted, and had, according to his account, barely acknowledged him, before going straight to bed. I remembered that evening clearly, once I read his description of it, and I remembered it very differently than he'd presented it. I'd worked a 14-hour day closing out a quarterly audit that had, itself, been the subject of considerable stress in our household for weeks beforehand, precisely because Theo had, at the time, encouraged me to push through it so we could afford a vacation we'd been planning. I'd come home, apologized for being so late, told him I loved him, and gone to bed because I could barely keep my eyes open. In his account, posted to several thousand strangers, this became evidence of a pattern of emotional neglect, the opening argument in a case I hadn't known was being built against me. I want to describe the specific structure of what followed, because it wasn't simply one impulsive post made in a moment of frustration and then abandoned. Theo had returned to that same thread, and to several subsequent threads he created, with a consistency and a deliberateness that unsettled me considerably more than the original post itself had. Roughly every 3 to 4 weeks, he'd posted an update, each one building on the previous narrative, each one adding new evidence, a phrase I use deliberately because that's precisely the language several of his posts actually used, framing screenshots of our text conversations, descriptions of arguments, and even details about my own family that I had shared with him in confidence, as documentation supporting his case. I found, scrolling through roughly the third update in that sequence, a screenshot of a text message I had sent him during an entirely ordinary disagreement about whose turn it was to handle a dentist appointment for our dog, a mundane, forgettable exchange I barely remembered having, presented in his post with a caption reading, "This is a good example of the dismissive tone I mentioned in my last post." I sat with that specific detail for a long time, understanding, with a growing, sinking clarity, that Theo had apparently been collecting these screenshots deliberately, saving ordinary, unremarkable exchanges specifically because he understood, even then, that he might eventually want to present them as evidence to an audience I had no idea existed. I want to explain what the comment sections of these posts actually looked like, because understanding the specific, escalating nature of the response he'd been receiving matters enormously to understanding why, I eventually came to believe, he kept returning to this same platform rather than ever simply talking to me directly. The earliest posts had received a modest, if genuinely alarming, level of engagement, several hundred comments each, the majority of them sympathetic to Theo's carefully curated version of events, strangers offering him validation, telling him he deserved better, that his wife sounded emotionally unavailable, that he should consider whether this marriage was actually worth continuing to invest in. By the fourth and fifth updates, the engagement had grown considerably, thousands of upvotes, comments numbering well into the several hundreds on each individual post, a genuine, sustained audience that had apparently been following what amounted to a serialized account of our marriage for months, forming increasingly confident opinions about me, a person none of them had ever met, based entirely on a narrative constructed by someone with an obvious, if perhaps not fully conscious, motive to present himself as the wronged party. I found, in one comment thread beneath an update posted roughly 2 months before my discovery, a lengthy response from another user, someone with a username suggesting they were also going through a difficult marriage, writing at length about how Theo's situation had helped them recognize similar patterns in their own relationship, thanking him for sharing something clearly so difficult, and encouraging him to consider whether he'd outgrown his own wife. I sat with that specific comment for a long time, understanding that Theo had, whether he intended this outcome or not, built an entire online community around a version of our marriage that existed only in that curated, one-sided form, a community of strangers who had collectively decided, based entirely on his account, that I was the problem in a marriage I had believed, right up until that Tuesday evening, was fundamentally solid, if occasionally difficult in the ordinary ways any long. Marriage is difficult. I want to describe the specific, methodical process I moved through over the following several hours, because I understood, sitting there on our couch with Theo's voice still audible from the next room, that I needed to fully understand the complete scope of what I was looking at before I said a single word to him about any of it. I opened a private browsing window, understanding, with a clarity that surprised even me given how genuinely shaken I felt, that I didn't want any trace of my own account showing up in his notifications, any indication that I discovered this before I was fully ready to confront it directly. I began systematically screenshotting every post, every update, every comment thread, working backward chronologically from the most recent post to the very first one, building my own record of exactly what he had built. By the time Theo finished his work call and came to find me on the couch, I had already documented 5 months of posts, comprising, by my own rough count, nearly 40,000 words of carefully constructed narrative about our marriage, presented to an audience that, across all his posts combined, numbered somewhere in the tens of thousands of individual readers, many of whom had left comments actively encouraging him to leave me, to stop wasting his life on someone who apparently didn't appreciate him, comments that, reading them now with full context, felt considerably less like strangers offering generic relationship advice and considerably more like an audience actively cheering for the end of my marriage, based entirely on evidence I had never once been given the opportunity to contest. I didn't say anything to Theo that evening. I want to explain why, because the decision required a specific kind of discipline I hadn't fully trusted myself to maintain, sitting there feeling the full, delayed shock of what I'd just spent several hours reading finally beginning to catch up with me. I understood, with a clarity that felt almost clinical given how raw I actually felt underneath it, that if I confronted him immediately, in that exact moment, I would very likely receive whatever explanation he'd already, unconsciously prepared, some version of events calibrated to minimize what he'd actually done, precisely the same careful narrative management skill he'd clearly been practicing for 5 months across an entire subreddit. I needed, before I said a single word, to understand the complete shape of what I was actually dealing with, rather than reacting immediately to the first, most devastating layer of it. I want to explain the specific process I moved through over the following several days, because it mirrored, in its own way, exactly the kind of careful, methodical documentation I imagine most people in my position would eventually need to rely on, though I hadn't consciously modeled it on anything at the time, simply following an instinct toward thoroughness that felt, in the moment, like the only stable ground available to me. I created my own account on the platform, entirely separate from anything connected to my real identity, specifically to read through every comment thread in full, understanding that Theo's own posts represented only half of what I needed to understand, and that the specific, cumulative effect of thousands of strangers validating his narrative mattered considerably too. Grasping the full emotional weight of what had actually been happening. I found, reading through those comment sections with considerably more attention than I'd initially managed, a pattern that unsettled me almost as much as Theo's own posts had. Several commenters, across multiple threads, had begun addressing him with a familiarity that suggested they'd been following his posts specifically, recognizing his username, referencing earlier updates, building, collectively, an ongoing narrative about our marriage that existed entirely independent of anything I had ever said or done, a narrative that had apparently taken on its own momentum, its own internal logic, entirely disconnected from whatever was actually happening inside our actual home. I found, in one of his more recent posts, dated roughly 6 weeks before my discovery, a passage that struck me with particular, specific force, because it described an evening I remembered with genuine clarity, an evening that had felt, at the time, like a good one, a quiet Friday where we'd ordered takeout and watched an entire season of a show together, laughing considerably, the kind of unremarkable, comfortable evening that had felt, living through it, like genuine evidence that our marriage was doing perfectly fine. In Theo's account, that same evening became something else entirely. He described feeling, throughout that evening, a persistent, underlying loneliness, writing that even during moments that appeared happy on the surface, he felt increasingly convinced I was simply going through the motions of a marriage I'd stopped actually investing in. I sat with that specific passage for a long time, understanding, with a growing, uncomfortable clarity, that Theo had apparently been reinterpreting entire portions of our actual, lived life, retroactively, through a lens I had no idea he was applying, turning genuinely happy memories into evidence supporting a case I hadn't known was being built. I want to explain what I eventually decided to do with all of this information, because the decision required considerably more deliberation than I initially expected, sitting with the full weight of 5 months of documentation spread across my own laptop screen. I called my sister, Priya, roughly 4 days after my initial discovery, having spent that entire time gathering information without saying a single word to Theo directly. I read her several of the more troubling passages over the phone, and I remember her going quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. "This isn't just him venting to strangers," she said. "This is him building a permanent record, a specific version of your marriage that other people have already validated, thousands of times over. If this ever comes up in any kind of serious conversation about your marriage's future, he already has an entire audience on record agreeing with him. You need to understand exactly what that means before you say anything to him." I want to describe the specific, uncomfortable process of understanding exactly what my sister meant by that, because it reshaped how I approached everything that followed. I understood, sitting with her observation, that Theo had built something considerably more consequential than a simple, private venting outlet. He had constructed, whether consciously or not, an entire external validation system, one that existed specifically to reinforce a particular narrative about our marriage, a narrative in which I was consistently, systematically framed as the emotionally unavailable, dismissive party, while his own behavior, his own choices, his own contributions to whatever genuine difficulties our marriage actually had, appeared nowhere in any of it, filtered out entirely by the simple fact that he was the sole author of every single post. I retained a therapist before I ever confronted Theo directly, a decision I made deliberately, understanding that I needed my own space to process the specific, disorienting quality of this particular betrayal before I brought it into a conversation with him. Dr. Alicia Fenwick, a careful, direct woman who specialized in trust and betrayal within long-term relationships, helped me understand something during our first several sessions that clarified, considerably, exactly what I'd actually discovered. "This isn't simply a communication problem," she told me, during our third session together, once I'd walked her through the full scope of what I'd found. A communication problem would be him struggling to tell you directly that he's unhappy. What you're describing is something different. He found an audience willing to validate a specific, one-sided narrative, and rather than ever risking that narrative being challenged by the person who actually lived through those events alongside him, he kept returning to an audience guaranteed to agree with him instead. I want to describe the specific evening I finally confronted Theo, because I chose the timing and the setting with considerable deliberation, understanding, by that point, exactly how I wanted this conversation to unfold. I waited nearly 2 full weeks after my initial discovery, using that time to finish organizing my own documentation, to work through my own emotional response with Dr. Fenwick's guidance, and to think carefully about exactly what I wanted to say and exactly what I wanted to understand from him before I said anything that might allow him to construct, in the moment, some careful, managed version of an explanation. I sat him down at our kitchen table on a quiet Sunday evening, and I opened my laptop, showing him, without any preamble, the screenshot of his most recent post's title. I watched his face change in real time, watched the specific, visible collapse of a man realizing, in an instant, that whatever careful, 5-month-long narrative construction he'd been managing had just, entirely and completely, run out of room to continue. "How did you find this?" he asked, his voice considerably smaller than I'd ever heard it, and I want to describe the specific detail of that question, because it told me something important in itself. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "Let me explain." Simply an immediate, reflexive concern about the mechanics of discovery, precisely the same instinct I'd later read about in other stories of betrayal, the specific priority of managing the damage rather than genuinely reckoning with what had actually happened. "That's not the question that matters right now," I told him, keeping my own voice as level as I could manage given how much genuine effort that actually required. "The question that matters is why, in 5 months, you never once brought any of this to me directly. Why you chose, instead, to build an entire public case against me, with thousands of strangers as your jury, rather than ever risking an actual conversation with the person you're supposedly upset with." He didn't have an immediate answer for that, and the silence that followed stretched long enough that I understood, watching him, exactly how unprepared he actually was to account for what he'd done, despite having spent 5 months meticulously documenting every grievance he apparently held against me. When he finally spoke, his explanation arrived in halting, uneven pieces, considerably less polished than anything he'd ever posted publicly. He told me he'd started posting, originally, during a period roughly 6 months ago when he'd felt genuinely overwhelmed by a difficult stretch at his own job, a stretch he'd never actually discussed with me in any real depth, and had found, in that first post's response, a kind of validation and attention he said he hadn't realized he was missing from our actual marriage. It felt easier, he admitted, staring down at the table rather than at me, to just say what I was feeling to people who didn't already know the whole complicated history, who would just believe me without needing me to justify every single thing. I want to describe the specific, complicated anger I felt hearing that explanation, because it wasn't simply straightforward fury, though that was certainly present in considerable measure. It was, more than anything, a kind of devastated recognition that Theo had apparently found it easier to seek validation from thousands of anonymous strangers than to risk an actual, vulnerable conversation with me, his own wife, someone who had shared 6 years of marriage with him, someone who might have actually helped address whatever genuine difficulties existed between us if he'd ever once given me the chance to hear about them directly, rather than learning about their existence only after they'd already been processed, packaged, and validated by an audience with absolutely no stake in our actual marriage's survival. "Do you understand," I asked him, "that you turned our marriage into content? That you took private, vulnerable details about my own family, moments between us that I trusted completely, and packaged them for strangers to judge, without ever once asking whether I was comfortable with any of it?" He didn't have a good answer for that either. I asked him, specifically, about the screenshots, about the deliberate, ongoing collection of ordinary text exchanges specifically for the purpose of eventually presenting them as evidence, and I watched him struggle, visibly, to explain a pattern of behavior that, laid out plainly in front of him, clearly sounded considerably more calculated than whatever internal justification he'd been operating under while actually doing it. I want to explain what happened over the following several weeks, because the process of actually working through this specific betrayal required considerably more time and structure than I initially expected, given how disorienting the entire situation genuinely felt. Theo and I began couples therapy together, working with a different practitioner than Dr. Fenwick, someone who specialized specifically in digital-era relationship trust violations, a specialty I genuinely hadn't known existed as a formal practice area until searching for exactly this kind of specific expertise. Our therapist, a measured, careful man named Dr. Owen Castellanos, helped both of us understand something during our earliest joint sessions that reframed, considerably, how I approached the entire situation going forward. What Theo did, Dr. Castellanos told us both during our third joint session, created something that functions almost like a permanent, distorted record of your marriage, one that exists independently of either of your own memories or understanding of events. That record doesn't simply disappear once you two work through this in private. It exists, permanently, as a kind of parallel history, one where thousands of strangers have already rendered judgment on a version of your marriage that was never actually accurate or complete. I want to describe the specific weight of hearing that observation articulated so plainly, because it clarified something I'd been struggling to fully name myself. This wasn't simply about Theo venting inappropriately, or even about a pattern of one-sided complaint. It was about an entire, permanent, public record existing somewhere on the internet, one that had already shaped the opinions of thousands of people who had no actual stake in whether our marriage survived, based entirely on a narrative I had never once had the opportunity to contest or correct. I made the decision, roughly 3 weeks after my initial discovery, to request that Theo delete every single post connected to our marriage, a request I understood, even as I made it, wouldn't fully undo the damage already done, given that comments, screenshots, and cached versions of deleted content often persist in various forms regardless of the original post's removal, but that felt, nonetheless, like a necessary, concrete step in reclaiming some measure of control over our own story. Theo agreed immediately, without any argument, and spent an entire evening, with me sitting beside him, methodically deleting every post, every update, every comment he could locate connected to that entire 5-month history. I want to describe something specific that happened during that process, because it added an unexpected layer to my own understanding of exactly what Theo had built. Scrolling through his own post history together, deleting entry after entry, we came across a message he'd received, roughly 2 months earlier, from another Reddit user, a private message rather than a public comment, and I want to be honest that reading it, sitting beside him at that moment, produced a specific, complicated reaction I hadn't fully anticipated. The message, from a stranger, described their own experience going through a very similar pattern in their own marriage, being validated repeatedly by an anonymous audience while never actually confronting their own spouse directly, and described, with what read as genuine, hard-won regret, how that specific dynamic had ultimately contributed to their own marriage's actual, permanent collapse, once their spouse eventually discovered what had been happening, considerably later and considerably more destructively than what Theo and I were currently working through. I don't know whether that specific message genuinely shifted something in Theo's own understanding of what he'd done, or whether it simply arrived at a moment when he was already, independently, beginning to grapple with the actual weight of his actions. What I do know is that he cried, quietly, reading it beside me, in a way I hadn't seen from him in years of marriage, and told me, his voice considerably more genuine than anything he'd offered during our initial confrontation, that he understood, finally and completely, exactly what he'd actually risked by choosing an anonymous audience over an honest, difficult conversation with the person who actually mattered. I want to spend some time describing the specific, gradual process by which Theo and I worked through establishing new boundaries around digital communication and disclosure, because it became a considerable, ongoing part of our therapy over the following several months. Dr. Castellanos helped us develop what he called a direct disclosure agreement, a specific, mutually understood commitment that any significant frustration or grievance either of us experienced regarding our marriage needed to be raised directly with each other, in private, before either of us discussed it with anyone else, whether that meant close friends, family members, or, obviously, anonymous strangers online. This wasn't, he explained carefully, about preventing either of us from ever seeking outside support or perspective, but about establishing a clear, mutual understanding that the person actually affected by any grievance deserved the first, direct opportunity to hear about it and respond, before any external audience was ever brought into the picture. I want to describe, honestly, how difficult I found the following several months, because I think it matters to give a complete, truthful account of this entire process rather than presenting some falsely tidy resolution. I struggled, considerably, with a specific, persistent anxiety about what else might exist, somewhere online, that I hadn't yet discovered, a worry Dr. Fenwick helped me understand as an entirely reasonable response to having discovered one significant, hidden betrayal, one that naturally raised questions about what other blind spots might exist in my own understanding of my marriage. I found myself, more than once during those difficult months, searching Theo's name across various platforms, checking for anything I might have missed, a specific kind of vigilance that Dr. Fenwick helped me understand as a normal, if exhausting, response to this particular kind of violation, one that would likely, gradually, ease over time as trust slowly, carefully rebuilt itself, provided Theo continued demonstrating the kind of direct, honest communication we'd both committed to. I want to describe something specific that happened roughly 4 months into our therapy process, because it represented, in its own way, a genuine turning point in how I understood Theo's capacity to actually change the specific pattern that had led to this entire situation. We'd had a genuinely difficult disagreement, one Sunday afternoon, about a financial decision he'd made without fully consulting me first, a disagreement that, in the version of our marriage that existed 5 months earlier, I suspect might have eventually become fodder for another carefully constructed post somewhere online. Instead, Theo brought it to me directly that same evening, told me plainly that he'd felt defensive and frustrated during our earlier disagreement, and asked whether we could talk through it properly rather than letting it sit unresolved. It was, in its own quiet, unremarkable way, exactly the kind of conversation I'd wished, for 5 months, he had simply had with me from the very beginning, rather than building an entire parallel, public narrative instead. I want to explain what eventually happened with the digital record itself, because it remained, for considerably longer than I initially expected, something I had to actively work through processing. Despite deleting every post and comment he could locate, I understood, through some research of my own, that certain archived versions of his posts likely still existed somewhere, cached by various third-party services that specifically preserve deleted Reddit content, meaning that the specific, permanent record Dr. Castellanos had described likely still existed in some form, regardless of our own efforts to remove it. I made a deliberate choice, with Dr. Fenwick's guidance, not to pursue tracking down every possible archived version, understanding that doing so would likely consume considerable energy without providing any genuine additional peace, and that my own healing needed to focus, instead, on rebuilding trust within our actual, current marriage rather than attempting to erase every trace of a betrayal that had already happened and couldn't, realistically, ever be fully undone in every corner of the internet. I think often, still, about that Tuesday evening, about the specific, mundane curiosity that led me to type Theo's username into a search bar, about how close I came to never fully understanding exactly what had been happening beneath the surface of our marriage for 5 entire months. I think about the specific, sinking recognition of that post title, "My wife still doesn't understand why I'm upset," and about everything that particular sentence revealed about a pattern of avoidance and external validation that had apparently been building, quietly, for considerably longer than I'd ever suspected. I understand, with real clarity now, considerable distance from that initial discovery, that whatever trust Theo and I have managed to rebuild exists specifically because we were both willing to do the genuinely difficult work of understanding exactly what had happened, rather than either minimizing it or allowing it to simply, permanently end a marriage that, once we finally addressed its actual, underlying difficulties directly, turned out to have considerably more genuine foundation than 5 months of one-sided Reddit posts had ever suggested. I want to describe, briefly, where things stand now, roughly a year and a half after that initial discovery, because I think it matters to give an honest account of how this entire situation actually resolved rather than ending on the specific, devastating note of discovery alone. Theo and I remain married, having done, over that following year and a half, considerable and genuinely difficult work together. In therapy, work that extended well beyond simply the Reddit posts themselves into a broader pattern of avoidance and indirect communication that, once we finally named it clearly, we both recognized had been quietly undermining our marriage in ways neither of us had fully acknowledged before that Tuesday evening forced everything into the open. I won't claim that I've fully, completely stopped thinking about those 5 months of posts, or about the specific, uncomfortable knowledge that thousands of strangers once formed opinions about me based on a narrative I never had the chance to contest. But I've come to understand that specific discomfort as something I can hold alongside a marriage that, for all its genuine flaws and difficulties, chose, ultimately, to do the harder, more honest work of actually facing what had gone wrong, rather than simply continuing to perform a version of resolution for an audience that never actually had any real stake in whether we survived at all. If you've made it this far with me tonight, I want to ask you something honestly, something I've turned over often in the months since that Tuesday evening changed everything I understood about my own marriage. If you discovered that your spouse had spent months quietly building a public, one-sided case against you, presenting your private life to thousands of strangers for judgment rather than ever bringing their concerns to you directly, would you have confronted them immediately, or would you have done what I did, quietly documenting everything first, understanding the complete shape of what you were actually dealing with before you said a single word out loud? I read every single comment on these stories, and I genuinely want to hear your answer tonight, while this is still sitting fresh with you. Tell me exactly where you're watching from, and tell me honestly whether you think Theo and I made the right decision staying together and doing the work, or whether you think some betrayals, even ones that don't involve any physical infidelity, should simply end a marriage outright. And if this story reached something real in you tonight, don't just close this video and move on to whatever comes next. Subscribe right now, because the stories waiting for you here are exactly the kind that people tell me, again and again, that they think about for days afterward. I'll see you in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.